Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders calling on Congress today to fix immigration policies and saying that this Trump order from last week is temporary while blaming Democrats for the mess.
The president's executive order has given a temporary solution to the problem, but it's not permanent, and we need Congress to step up. We need Democrats to stop playing political games, do their jobs, work with this president, and let's fix the problem at the border.
That's the White House argument today. Keep in mind, it's over 2,000 children who remain separated from their parents, many all over the nation because of Trump's policy. Now, MSNBC's Cal Perry has gotten one of the first looks inside a tent camp. This is in Tornillo, Texas, that holds 300 children, 23 separated from their parents under the now partially discontinued policy. Here's what the emergency manager told him.
The shelter would not have been necessary without the separations. Quote, the crisis was made as a result of the decision to separate the kids. Quote, separations should never have happened. The process is flawed, he said, and it harmed the children.
I'm joined now by Enrique Morones, founder and director of the immigrant rights group Border Angels, and Reverend Al Sharpton, president of National Action Network. Of course, my colleague is the host of Politics Nation. And I should mention, Rev, you just got back from visiting children at another Texas detention center. Let's start there. Nothing new about the American civil rights movement engaging with international issues. As a legal matter, as we've been reporting, some of the people that you're visiting with may not have the legal right to be here. They may not stay here. Walk us through what you see as the human rights issue here, Rev.
Well, I think the human rights issue is clear. You're talking about a decision to separate the children from their parents, and the children may never be reconciled. I think a lot of what people are missing, Ari, is if they did not have a plan to reconcile the families when the president signed the executive order, then they never had a plan, because all they had to do was go ahead and use the plan they were going to use down the line when they had gone through their process. So it was really that they had no intention of dealing with the human value here. Where we got involved, civil rights groups, is you have two borders to this country. You have the Canadian border and the Mexican border. Why did the president say we're going to separate families coming over the Mexican border, which are South Americans and Central Americans? Because he knew they wouldn't tolerate one or two babies taken from a white Canadian. So the race involved, the dehumanization involved, and now when we see in East Harlem over 200 children, some of them are part of this group of children that were denied because of family separation. They're in communities everywhere.
I wonder, Rev, whether the premise of the statement you make, which of course some in the White House would strenuously object to, is that also Donald Trump thought that the absence of white children, of white babies here, would mean that he would, quote unquote, get away with this. Was he wrong?
I think that he may or may not have been wrong. The question is the position morally and legally wrong? And I think the answer is clear. How do you have any double standards in the application of law and it not be wrong legally and morally? He's not banning all people that come in here illegally, saying, or he did not ban that, saying you will have family separation. He only did it in this particular case, and one can only ask the question, why? Particularly when we have a decrease in numbers of people coming across the Mexican border into the United States.
Enrique, walk us through what you see as the priority when we are here gathered tonight with 2,053 children, at least, still effectively orphaned by Trump administration policy.
Well, as usual, the Reverend is absolutely right. This is a racial issue. It's horrific what Donald Trump is doing. No other country in the Americas has a wall. No country in the world separates children. And if these children were white, if they were Canadian or Norwegian like he likes, they would not be separated. What he is doing is inhumane. The whole world is watching. I was at a detention facility on Friday with Senator Kamala Harris. What is happening is unbelievable. How can you separate a child from their parent? And that picture, you know, that made for a picture moment of signing an executive order, which has no legs to stand on. Donald Trump is pure evil. What he is doing is horrific. The whole world is watching, including our children. We teach our children to love their neighbor, not to do bullying. And what is taking place right now, there's people that have been sent back to Central America. They don't know where their children are. The children never got to say goodbye to their parents. It is the worst of the American spirit, and we need to continue to rise up and demand change, as Reverend Sharpton did in the Civil Rights Movement. We need to do that now.
A lot of people are arguing it's not the American spirit. It's antithetical to it. You mentioned Senator Harris, who's one of the many people who've done these visits, trying to use their power and their platform to draw attention to it so people can deal with the facts of what's happening to these people, to these children in the facilities. Take a look at Senator Booker and Senator Harris and others.
Zero tolerance policies that really are undermining actually things that were working, processes that were established. And we have, unfortunately, administration that I think is committing moral vandalism.
I think there's no question that we've got to critically re-examine ICE and its role and the way that it is being administered and the work it is doing. And we need to probably think about starting from scratch.
It's wrong to separate babies, to use cruel, inhumane policies in order to gin up your political base.
Rev, for you, a final thought on what we're hearing there, and also what you're hearing when, you know, in the old days, a lot of white politicians claimed they were for the Constitution while doing things in Jim Crow that undermined the Bill of Rights. Talk to us about where we stand tonight with a president openly saying he's against the Fifth Amendment due process protection, just admitting it.
I think that we are, and after going down with Sister Norma at the center and seeing some of the families, we are in the middle of a real moral crisis and a legal crisis. And I think that the country deserves and must have legal leadership and moral leadership that will stand up and say that when we have a president that just disavows the Constitution, then what are we talking about? It's a threat to anybody, and it may start in Mexico. It will come to all of us. We cannot allow this to be unaddressed and not confronted.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.